All right, I'm not going to do any kind of review of Lesson 6 since we already covered that last week and we finished that review. So we're going to cover our questions for page 61 and 62, which are the questions for Lesson 6. And then there's something I want to cover before we get to Lesson 7. All right, so for the questions on page 61, yes or no. Number 1, are all Darwinian assertions supported by solid facts? No. Number 2, evolutionists teach that complex biological organisms evolved slowly over millions of years until they were complete. Yes, that's true. Number 3, does irreducible complexity show that organisms could not have evolved gradually until their biochemical systems were fully and functionally complete? Yes. Irreducible complexity is the idea that you can't take anything out and have it still function the way it's supposed to. Question 4, did Solomon say, I will praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made? David said that. See, this is what I talk about, why I appreciate Josh's questions. There's the details are the tricky parts there. Number 5, carbon-14 dating can provide the ages of organic materials up to 1 million years. More like 40,000, yeah. Number 6, Peter said that some are always learning but never able to acknowledge the truth. Paul said that. Again, assuming these aren't typos on Josh's end or whoever typed it up, those would be no. All right, fill in the blank. Dr. Michael Behe said the Darwinists have a lot of what at their disposal? Psychological tricks. Oh yeah, sorry, I didn't move you. Psychological tricks. Number 2, Charles Darwin said if it could be demonstrated that any blank blank existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive blank blank, my theory would absolutely break down. Complex organs, yep, if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. Number 3, we use 2 examples of man-made irreducibly complex systems. What 2 are they? Yep, the engine motor, the internal combustion motor, and the mousetrap. Number 4, we provided 6 biological illustrations of irreducible complexity. Which 2 did he go in depth into? The eye and the flagellum. Yeah, the flagellum, the little spinny thing on the back of these things that he mentioned. It's like a propeller. Number 5, David said, many, O Lord my God, are your wonderful works. And of course, some of these words may be slightly different depending on your translation. Which you have done, your thoughts toward us cannot be recounted to you in order. If I would declare and to speak of them, they are more than can be numbered. Number 6, 3 unprovable assumptions that must be made when using radiometric dating are: first one is that when the uranium formed, what must not have been present? The lead. Yeah, the lead. Neither the uranium nor lead has decreased in what? Mass. Okay, that's another assumption, is that the mass of these radioactive elements haven't seeped into other things or has seeped from other things. And then finally, the decay rates, it's assumed that the decay rates have remained what? Constant. Yes, constant.
That just goes against all radioactive theory, though, because everything has a half-life.
Everything has a half-life, but I think the idea there is that the half-life rates have stayed consistent over millions or billions of years is the idea there. And that may not necessarily be the case. We'll talk more about that in just a minute. All right, short answer. What 2 reasons does Jesus give in John chapter 3 for people not wanting to come to the light? Sure, yeah, they don't believe in the name of Jesus. Remember, Jesus says that men loved darkness. Okay, they hated the light. Why? Because their deeds are evil and they don't want their deeds to be exposed. So yeah, they loved darkness, they hated the light, they hate Jesus, and they don't want their deeds exposed. Number 2, explain the difference between reducible and irreducible. As we already discussed a little bit, the idea of reducible and irreducible is basically functional versus non-functional, or vice versa. If you can reduce it and it still works, then that supposedly promotes the theory of evolution. If it can't be reduced, you can't take one piece out or even reduce them in some functional way, key components within a certain function, and it won't actually produce what it needs to produce, then that means it had to have come into creation or come into existence all at once. And it can't have added to or gradual process been made to make that happen. All right, let's see. Number 3. What lesson could evolutionists learn from Solomon's teaching in Ecclesiastes chapter 11, verse 5? Remember, he talks about how that just as we don't know the way of wind and how baby's bones are formed in the womb, so also we don't understand what the Lord does. And I think one of the lessons there is that there are going to be some things that are going to be beyond our understanding, and that's okay. I know that's not what science, supposedly that's not what technically science stands for. It's the learning of our environment, of nature, of the natural world, trying to understand the systems involved. And I get that, but there are going to be some things that are going to be outside of our purview of understanding when it comes to what God did. Of course, that always goes back to your worldview, whether or not you believe in God. Question 4. What other examples of irreducible complexity among human inventions can you think of? Old school telephones. Remember the rotary phone? With some pride, I will admit to breaking my parents' rotary phone on multiple occasions by taking off the circle thing, the thing that was
The rotor.
the rotor, yeah, the rotor part. What happens when you take that off?
The rotor.
It don't rotor, okay? It doesn't move, it doesn't work. What happens if you take the cable line going to the headset? It don't work, okay? There are certain things, a computer, for instance, if you take out, or even damage, even single little components on a motherboard or on a stick of RAM, it's not going to work, at least not the way it's supposed to. And that's, the kind of an example of irreducible complexity. These things have to be there and have to function and serve their purpose efficiently in order for the entire organism or the entire machine to function properly. What about nature, natural things? Okay, one thing that I wrote down was both on plant and animal life, the reproductive systems. Okay, you take any one of those components for plant life, you think about bees and pollen right now during spring, and the type of system that exists that God put in place for plants to be pollinated, for flowers to bloom and all of that. You take all of that, any one of those things out, you disrupt that system. Does it work? No, it doesn't work. Okay, those systems have been put in place and they have to exist in order for them to function. And if you disrupt those systems, if you eliminate all bees, what else is going to get eliminated? Okay, flowers, they're not going to be pollinated anymore. So that's part of the problem with that. And that's just one example. Number 6, explain how radiometric dating proves that coal and diamonds are only thousands and not millions or billions of years old. Carbon. It has carbon in it. They found carbon in diamond, carbon in coal. These things are supposed to be millions and millions of years old. However, if that were true, there would be no carbon. And yet they have found carbon in it. Okay, and I'm not going to cover the discussion question. I mean, there's a lot of different ways you can go with that. My response was, yeah, I would just go to Darwin's quote. If it could be proved that any one of these things, wouldn't work, if you could reduce them and they didn't work, then that would destroy my theory. And to me, that would kind of be the response to that. Now, interestingly enough, okay, we've been doing this book so far for 4 lessons, 6 lessons total, so 6 classes. We have gotten more views on these classes than any other videos that we've produced in terms of timeline. Okay, there are other videos with more views, but not as quickly as we've been getting on these. And I can't speak for all of the individuals who've been watching it, but some of them have not been watching with great adoration or enjoyment or anything. We've gotten a whole lot of dislikes and a whole lot of comments, especially on last week's video. I posted that Saturday, and we have 105 views as of today. And that may not sound like a lot in YouTube terms, but for us, that's a lot. In 4 days, it's 105 views. We have 6 dislikes, and we have 5 negative comments. Now, most of these negative comments are originating with the material. Some of them are directed at me, but very few of them have anything to do with any constructive response. Usually it's something along the lines of this is all lies, or the Bible's just a metaphysical concoction, and so forth. But last week's was there's so much contained in that people responded to. I wanted to address a little bit regarding the dating aspect. Okay, and I'm not going to go too deep into some of this stuff, but these are all isotopes that are used when it comes to radiometric dating or radioisotopic dating. We talk about carbon, and its daughter isotope is nitrogen. Uranium-238, which is what Josh also mentioned, goes to lead-206. And there's several others as well that are utilized to determine, quote-unquote, the age of a particular piece of rock or bone or whatever. Now, as Josh mentioned, there are a bunch of assumptions that are made regarding that type of dating. The exact mix of radioactive decay elements in rock when formed is already known. They're making that assumption. And it's assumed that it begins with 100%. So if you start off with something at 100% carbon, and then by the time you get to date it, there's only 30% carbon left, and then you measure the nitrogen, you see how much nitrogen you have, you can claim based on the decay rate, this is how long has passed. But you're assuming that the hourglass, so to speak, was full when it started. Okay, sometimes you can start an hourglass at only 30 minutes. Okay, what if something already had a certain amount of lead in it when it was formed? It's assumed that no inherited daughter elements existed within that piece of rock or within that piece of material prior to the uranium or whatever it may be coming in contact with it. And the assumption about elements that decay at the same rate, understand we've only had the technology to measure decay rates for the last 100 years. So you're talking about an extremely small sample size, all right? It's the highest of arrogance to suggest that scientists can know for sure that over the past supposed 4.5 billion years, those decay rates have never changed. In fact, somebody mentioned as a comment on the YouTube video, well, to say the decay rates have been inconsistent, that means that all the laws of physics will go out the window. Well, that's entirely not true. Okay, especially when you start looking at how they determine decay rates, and a lot of times the decay rates, it's not just based on the atomic clock that they utilize. Sometimes it's based on other things, and then they tweak it slightly to make it fit where they want it to be. And then the fact that no elements have seeped out or in, meaning it's a closed system, and that certainly isn't true. Evidence has shown uranium and things like that can seep into other things that don't have uranium in them to start with, and that can completely throw off any dating process. None of these are provable. They can be provable right now in the sense of this is what it has now. This is how much this decay rate is now. But they cannot say with 100% certainty this is the way it was when this rock was formed. And that's not debatable. Okay? There is no argument there. You cannot prove that. It's just assumed. Now, I want to mention a couple of specifics here because I did a deep dive into some of this, and that rabbit hole goes really, really deep if you start really looking at all of the examples that a lot of these I had never heard of, the examples that have come up of outside of the realm of accepted numbers and so forth, outliers, I guess you could say, that scientists ignore or throw away or don't acknowledge even exist sometimes. For instance, DNA experts who are not creationists, okay, they're just experts in DNA, they are absolutely insistent that DNA left to itself could not last for longer than 10,000 years. Okay. In any environment, it can't last for more than 10,000 years. And yet, intact strands of DNA from fossils that supposedly existed 66 million years ago have been found. Now, the argument might be, well, some external force must have come in and somehow preserved that DNA. Yet they use that same argument against creationists when we suggest maybe some external force came in and changed the decay rate of elements. Some natural catastrophe may have allowed for certain things to be different than they are now. And yet they'll use the same argument with this. This is an interesting, polonium-210. There's, in fact, if you look it up, it's really interesting, but there's a halo around some of these radio halos around this polonium-210 elements that when you measure them. And the width of the halo tells you how much certain elements have dissipated over time. Well, these supposed squashed polonium, in other words, there's supposed to be more there than there is, indicate that the Jurassic, the Triassic, and the Eocene formations in the Colorado Plateau were deposited within months of one another, not hundreds of millions of years that separated apart. Think about the different strata formations in the Grand Canyon, okay? And the different, they say, well, so this is the Cambrian, and this is the Jurassic, and this is whatever. And yet, when you start looking at the dating between those, some of the lower sediments date as younger than the higher sediments, which are supposed to be the younger ones, which doesn't make a lot of sense. Orphan polonium-218 radio halos having no evidence of mother elements imply accelerated nuclear decay and very rapid formation of associated minerals. In other words, the dating process is off. And they have no explanation for that. And that's something that repeatedly comes up, is that these types of issues, there is no explanation. In fact, probably to try to provide an explanation would simply give some sort of attention to these issues. And they don't want any attention drawn to these things. Uranium and thorium, they generate helium atoms as they decay lead. A study published in the Journal of Geophysical Research showed that such helium produced in zircon crystals in deep, hot, Precambrian granitic rock had not had time to escape. And that being the case, though the rocks contain 1.5 billion years worth of nuclear decay products, newly measured rates of helium loss from zircon show the helium has only been leaking for about 6,000 years, give or take 2,000 or so. In other words, there's a disconnect between the date of the actual rock and the grains within the rock that measure far younger than the rock itself. That doesn't make any sense. This suggests there have been episodes of greatly accelerated decay rates of long-life nuclei within thousands of years ago, compressing these timelines. Now, does this prove the 6 days of creation? No. What it shows, though, is the issue with what is widely accepted, this narrative of this radiometric dating as being these millions or even billions of years old, when you have so many conflicting numbers, sometimes so vast as a number of 6,000 years versus 1.5 billion years. Something's wrong. These numbers should all be in unison. They should all say the same thing, and they don't. And that's one of the big problems. It's assumed, in fact, it's taught in textbooks, that the different methods, remember those different elements we noted that turn into daughter elements later on as they decay? All of those, no matter what dating method you use, if you measure the same sample using each one of those dating methods, it should all come up with the same age. That's just a general thought process. But as I mentioned with the Grand Canyon, there's basalt lava. They use 3 different testing methods, all in the same area, but same sample size of the Grand Canyon. They had 3 different ages. The potassium to argon was 0.5. The rubidium to anyway, whatever the other one is, 1.1 billion, and then you had the other one at 1.5 billion. Okay, 3 largely different timelines. So which one's right? Well, in that kind of a situation, they take the average between the 3. Even though there's a million years difference between the youngest and the oldest, they'll just take the average. The different ages, however, the fact that there are different ages using the same samples with different methods proves that there's something wrong with the dating itself. Because if it were consistent, every single one of those methods would be dated the same, or at least in the same general 100,000 years or so. But they're not. widely different. And it's assumed there's a process called the isochron technique. And that is to say that in the same location, you take 4 samples in the same kind of square foot. Okay? You take 4 samples. That way you have the same, supposedly the same methodology, the same chronology of that sediment. And then you test all 4. But when all 4, within the exact same area, come back with different dates, well, what are you supposed to do? And this is part of the problem. We don't hear about the issues regarding the technique and the different numbers and the debate within how are we going to figure this out. All we hear is the final number, which is usually the average. And we don't hear about the actual problem with the dating itself. Dr. Andrew Snelling, he said most people believe that when the different radioisotope dating methods are used on the same rock, they all yield the same age. However, the radioisotope dating of 27 Grand Canyon rocks clearly demonstrates that the disagreement or isochron discordance is pronounced. Even when the calculated error margins are taken into account, the different radioisotope dating methods yield completely different ages that cannot be reconciled. There is no explanation for that. Now, Josh brought up the Mount St. Helens example with the lava dome and how that this lava dome was created back in the 80s, and yet it came back with dates ranging from, 0.5 to 2 billion years old, or million years old. 0.5 billion and 2.5 billion. But what they discovered, or what they came up with, was they realized that as Mount St. Helens erupted, the amount of argon that was in the steam and in the gases that were released, it got trapped in some of that rock, in that lava. And so that's why it had more argon than expected. Okay, that makes sense, right? But do we see the problem here? You're making the assumption that everything else you test doesn't have that exact same issue. You're saying that just escaped gases can completely change the dating so badly that something that happened, now about 40 years ago, will give off dates of billions of years? Well, why can't that be true for a lot of the other stuff as well? How do you know that didn't happen with the other stuff? Multiple lava flows in Hawaii, which were known to be created, there's several examples in the 1800s, 1900s, and most recently as well. They're dated to millions of years, but we know for a fact when those lava flows were created. And it's been confirmed that those lava flows, that was what started the dating. We're not talking about magma in the liquid form. It's after it's exposed to oxygen, that's when the dating starts. And yet it was dated to millions of years. 10, what's known as the Republic of Congo or Zaire diamonds, were dated at 6 billion years old. Now, what's the current estimate of the age of the Earth? 4.5. So those diamonds existed prior to the Earth being formed, if that's the case. There's a Himalayan granite stone that was dated around 20 million years. The zircon uranium level was dated at 1.4 billion years. So notice we go from 20 million to 1.4 billion, but then the monazite uranium, guess what it measured at? Not 97 million years, minus 97 million years. In other words, it hasn't been formed yet. But it's there. Do you see the issue? You see the problem? Nobody has heard about the minus 97 million. You don't read that in the articles about anything about this Himalayan granite. You read about, it's between 100 million and 900 million years old. Again, they take the average. They completely leave out the fact that one very important component of this granite measured at being so young it doesn't even exist and won't exist for another 97 million years. That's how weird some of these things come back on. Now, a lot of these scientists will say those are just outliers. The reality is, no, not really. They're not. They're examples of why there's issues with this type of dating when you're making the assumptions that you're making. Even contamination, talk about contamination, the seeping, the open system, which they assumed was a closed system, even the seeping in of different elements or seeping out of different elements don't account for that. Especially when you take into account taking these samples all from the same area and then getting different results, different ages. There's examples of fossilized wood and bone, coal, oil, natural gas that all contain carbon-14, but they shouldn't. Because again, those things are supposed to be millions and millions of years old, but the carbon-14 should have been gone at most 40 to 50,000 years ago. Carbon-14 also assumes the same amount of carbon-14 in the environment as today. And yet, carbon-14 has fluctuated just in the last 100 years. The amount of carbon-14 has fluctuated in our own environment, much less thousands of years ago. So again, there's a whole lot of variation there. There's a whole lot of unknown there. There's actual soft tissue. They found 2 worms from the Cambrian era, Cambrian age, that has soft tissue in it. This is supposed to have been millions and tens of millions of years ago. And yet, the soft tissue exists. And there's also the famous story about the Tyrannosaurus Rex with the tendons and everything else. It's also a part of that as well. Now, the point of all of this, and one of the things that one of the commenters on our video last week mentioned, is, well, you could make the same claim about the Bible, that you're making assumptions. Well, here's the difference between the two. The purpose of looking at this is not to prove the Bible. That's not the point. The Bible proves itself. It's on its own, and either you have faith in it or you don't. It's not to prove the Bible. The Bible doesn't need any supporting evidence to prove it. It's to show the issues with what the accepted scientific narrative is. Someone once said that validation is belief plus observation. And when it comes to scientific validation, you have to have, here's what you believe happened. Now, where is the observation of facts that actually support that? Where do the facts take us? Well, our faith in the Bible is informed by observation. The heavens declare the handiwork of God. Okay, the creation speaks, Romans 1 verse 20, how that, within, we can see God's power, God's handiwork in creation. Our faith is informed by observation. It's not dependent upon it. Science, however, is dependent on observation. It requires observation for it to even be passed off as fact. So either we allow unprovable assertions to cause us to doubt the Bible, or we trust the Bible as being God's word, regardless of what narrative or interpretation or thought process, worldview, bias scientists may have regarding how they read things. Now, to be clear, even dismissing all of these issues with the radiocarbon dating, the radiometric dating with uranium, dismissing all of that, could God have created these elements to be the age that they are? Sure. Could he have created these things with the half-life that they have? Sure. There's no problem there. And even, the issue here isn't about proving the Bible. God could have done all of that and made it that way just because. And yet it's on science to support what it says, not with current day facts. You have to be able to reproduce what happened. And that will never be the case. You can never reproduce macroevolution, first of all, because it doesn't exist. It's outside of the realm of science. But you can never reproduce the areas when these things were created. You can't go back and prove that this is how much was here at that time. And so you're basing what you have on today. Well, guess what? We've got that lava dome from Mount St. Helens. We've got multiple other things that have been created recently. Do we have recent dates for those? No. So what makes you think the dating from the past is going to be any better if we can't even date stuff that was formed 20 years ago? That's the problem. And that's why when people, we don't understand why people are so skeptic. There's no answer for those things. Give us an answer as to why these things, they have an answer. Oh, there's more argon there. Okay, well, prove that that wasn't the case 1,000,000 years ago. And they can't. All right, I wanted to talk a little bit about that because just in case you have a friend or a neighbor who watched a video, maybe you mentioned something to them, maybe they were one of the 105 that watched it, they have a question about that. I wanted to deal with just a little bit with that and address that and make the point that this isn't about proving God. Are we ever going to be able to prove God in a lab? No. No. Again, our faith is informed by observation. We can see things in nature and in creation that speak to what God did. But it's not dependent upon scientific observation. Science is. All right, so let's move on into lesson 7. Lesson 7, Josh deals with 3 more defeated Neo-Darwinian dogmas. He talks about the tree of life that Charles Darwin interestingly named or termed to kind of be a substitute for the tree of life of the Bible. He talks about homology, animal homology, basically the same different structures in different animals. He talks about embryology, and then he talks about the peppered moth. So within this, he mentions far too often in history, Darwinian proponents have resorted to trickery or falsehoods in order to support their false premise. And he's going to address that in 2 particular examples that were shown to not just be accidentally in error, they were fraudulent. But he talks about Darwin's tree of life. And he proposed that all living things started from ancient ancestors, a limited number of animals or a limited number of living things that then branched off. And he believed that you would be able to, via the fossil record and other things, be able to show a direct line to everything branching off, like starting from a tree trunk, branching off in different directions, how that these different things went different ways. But that's presuming, again, first of all, something that now scientists are walking back, that quote-unquote macroevolution is linear. Now they say, no, it's 1 step forward and 2 steps back, which kind of defeats the purpose, personally, I think. But anyway, you kind of lose the plot there if that's the case, because it's supposed to be more efficient, and it's not. But now that has been debunked largely because of DNA. Because the thought process is once the DNA came in fact, scientists were all excited because now we're going to be able to prove what things are related to what things. And then they actually get into it and they begin to realize these things aren't related. And that completely destroys our entire thought process regarding the evolutionary tree. He talks about what's called comparative anatomy. You see 2 similar processes or 2 similar functions in a living being, this living being, that living being, and the assumption is, well, they must be related somehow. Okay? There's similarities between certain species. Certain arms or certain legs or whatever are similar between this species and that species, fundamentally speaking, then they must be related somehow. However, this isn't necessarily a hard and fast rule. Because just because they have the same construction or a similar construction, that doesn't necessarily mean they come from the same ancestor. And it's really interesting, the circular logic that Josh pointed out here is he brings up the octopus and the human eye. Scientists are absolutely vehement that octopus and humans aren't related. And yet, octopus and human have very similar eye structure. In fact, more so than any other supposed closer related animals, they don't have similar eyes. But yet we and the octopus do. He brings up the same point about a bird wing and a bat wing. Supposedly, I mean, in fact, he even has the schematic of the different wings and so forth and what they're like. You could see the similarities there, yet scientists say, no, they're not related. Well, why not? Well, and then that's where you start getting into that logic circle. How can you tell if something's related? Well, if they have similar structures. Well, how can you tell if they have similar structures? Well, if they're related. So then you get into that cycle, back and forth, especially in the absence of any DNA evidence now. See, before they were assuming there was DNA evidence to show that these things are related versus not related, and now there's not. And Josh brought up an excellent example of the same contractor using the same materials to build a house versus an apartment. Okay? Now, apartments have very different needs and very different internal structures than a house does, but seemingly from the outside, might it look similar? Especially if they're using the same brick, they're using the same drywall, maybe even the same type of paint inside, the same type of furniture or cabinets inside. Would it look similar? Sure. Okay? And that's what he's pointing out, is that the same creator did this stuff with the genetics and with the functioning forelimbs and wings and all this stuff. The same creator utilized it, but that has nothing to do with somehow random evolution or random chance. The assumption, if we find homologous organs in different species, they should be shown to be related via genes. But then now they've been shown that these organs have different genes that control their formation. In fact, this has been a huge blow to evolutionists, because they were assuming that that was the case, and now they found that it's not. And it's, in fact, he had several quotes from evolutionists saying that this is they're going to have to come up with a whole different model to determine an evolutionary tree, because things that we thought were related aren't related. Josh brings up Hox genes, and specifically the TBX5 gene, which is a selector gene in vertebrate forelimbs. Okay, there's different, this particular gene, all it does is select which genes are going to form those muscles and those bones and so forth. Well, the fact that all vertebrates have TBX5 genes doesn't show macroevolution, because why? It's not the developmental gene. See, in order to show association of ancestry or lineage or some sort of connection via DNA, it has to be from the same developmental gene. We have to have been developed using the same gene some other animal used to develop its arms, but we don't. We use a different one. Well, evolution wouldn't have any reason to do that. And random mutation can't account for that. Therefore, there's no common ancestor there. It's using the same pieces, but different ways to bring about a different result. Evolution can't make that determination. That certainly doesn't account for random chance. Molecular phylogeny should show animals supposedly related via evolution to be related genetically, yet that has proven to be the opposite. And he quoted one of the evolutionists saying that scientists started analyzing a variety of genes from different organisms and found that their relationship to each other contradicted the evolutionary tree of life. And he brings up a couple of examples. He mentions that the crocodile and the chicken and the viper and the chicken, based on the alpha hemoglobin, they're somewhat closely related. It's like 17% and 10%. So you would assume, by kind of the law of association here, that the croc and the viper should be pretty well associated. They should be pretty well related, especially given that both are reptiles. But are they? 5% similarity. In other words, a crocodile is more related to a chicken than it is the viper, and vice versa, and the viper to the chicken as opposed to the crocodile. He brings up as well the gray whale. This is based on the sequence of cytochrome C. The gray whale is more similar to a duck. Gray whale's a mammal than a monkey. Monkey's a mammal. You would think two monkeys would be more closely related than to a duck, but no. Tuna is more similar to a rabbit than a dogfish. A turtle is more similar to birds than a fellow reptile, the snake, which flies directly in the face of the evolutionary theory. Embryology talks about Haeckel's embryos, the fact that this was a fraudulent thing. It proposed that all embryos exhibited previous evolutionary iterations. And you can see the picture of what Haeckel's embryos, what he provided, different stages like of human biology, embryology, showing previous stages of evolution. But in Science, 1997, it says it was proven fraudulent as one of the most famous fakes in biology. All right, we will stop there. We will pick up with the rest of lesson 7 and do our questions next week. Again, I apologize for taking off there in between the two. I wanted to address some of those things about the radiometric dating. And if you're ever interested in stuff like that, there's a whole lot of resources available to look at some of the in-depth. Some of it's very technical, but some of it is also spoken for pretty plain language as well. So, all right, thank you, everybody.